imagine an island, right?
Mm.
And the most valuable export from this island isn't sugar, it isn't bauxite, and it's definitely not coffee.
Right.
The most valuable export is the people. But here is the massive catch, and this is what we're getting into today. Once those people leave, they never actually, like, disconnect from the island.
Yeah, it completely defies how we usually think about borders. I mean, normally you look at a map, you see a piece of land surrounded by water, and you just assume, well, that's the container.
Exactly.
That is where the nation starts and ends.
We really like our maps to have those solid, comforting lines.
Oh, absolutely.
But when you step into the history of the Jamaican diaspora, which we are doing today, those solid lines they just dissolve. They vanish into these sprawling, glowing global networks.
They really do.
And that's exactly why we are so incredibly excited to welcome you, our listener, to a very special, expansive journey. A 7-part deep dive into the Jamaican diaspora.
It's going to be a massive journey.
It is. And to kick things off, there is this famous, really intriguing quote from our research. It simply says, no matter where in the world you go, there is likely a Jamaican living there.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement, and I think it gets straight to the core thesis we'll be exploring in this deep dive.
For sure.
History often records migration as, a simple change of address, someone moving from point A to point B, written into a ledger somewhere.
Right, a neat little statistic.
Exactly. But if we actually look at the historical data, Jamaican identity operates completely differently. It's not an abandonment of an island. It is a highly strategic transnational footprint.
So we have a clear mission for you today. We are going to completely shatter the myth of the quote-unquote romanticized exodus.
Yes.
We're going to uncover the grueling reality of why people really left, and we're going to introduce a core concept called circularity.
Circularity, right.
That one word is basically going to be your lens for this entire 7-part series.
And to understand where they went, when we first have to understand exactly why they had to leave.
Right.
And all the historical records point us directly to one year, which is 1838, the dawn of full emancipation in Jamaica.
Okay, let me just stop you right there.
Yeah.
Because here's where I really want to push back on that traditional narrative of immigration that a lot of us grew up with.
Oh, the romantic adventure trope.
Yes. You know the story. Someone packing a single suitcase, looking longingly at the horizon, setting off on a spontaneous adventure to find a better life.
Right, right.
That narrative implies like a luxury of choice.
Yeah.
It implies you're choosing between a good life and a potentially great one.
Which is absolutely not what was happening in post-emancipation Jamaica. Leaving the island was rarely a simple choice, and it certainly wasn't romantic.
Not at all.
When you look at the mechanics of it, this was a grueling, highly calculated, and deeply pragmatic strategy for survival.
Wait, okay, calling it a highly calculated strategy makes it sound like a sterile boardroom decision,
Yeah.
like a bunch of executives looking at a spreadsheet.
I see what you mean, yeah.
But we're talking about people who were formerly enslaved, right? Trying to forge a life in a society that was fundamentally built to exploit them. Wasn't this just sheer desperation rather than calculated global economics?
Well, that is the crucial tension. It was sheer desperation, yes, but the response to that desperation was brilliantly calculated.
Okay, how so?
Let's look at the mechanics of why the local economy became what historians call brittle.
Brittle, right?
After 1838, the plantation owners suddenly lost their free labor force, and instead of paying fair wages to the newly emancipated peasantry, many estates just collapsed.
They just folded.
Exactly. The sugar industry completely crashed. And then you add to that a series of devastating natural disasters, intense political violence.
Total perfect storm.
Yes, the ground beneath these people was literally and economically giving way.
So basically, the local market to sell your labor just vanished overnight.
Precisely. If you are a newly free person, your only real asset is your physical labor. When the local environment becomes too brittle to support life, you don't just randomly throw darts at a map and hope for the best.
You can't afford to.
No, you have to calculate exactly where your labor has the highest immediate market value on the global stage.
And the research shows they specifically targeted regions that temporarily, and this is a chilling phrase, needed bodies.
Needed bodies, yeah. It's a pragmatic, brutal reality of global economics.
It really is.
But I think it highlights their incredible agency. They were perfectly timing their movements with massive global shifts. They went exactly where empires and industries were desperate for muscle.
Which brings us to the map itself. Because if we understand that they moved specifically to where bodies were needed, we have to look at the mechanics of that global demand.
You do.
Instead of just listing off dates, let's look at how the value of Jamaican labor evolved on the global market.
And this is essentially the historical blueprint for the next 6 parts of our deep dive. The movement didn't just happen all at once.
No.
It happened in very distinct eras of global demand.
Right. And the first era was really about raw physical extraction. Initially, the post-emancipation peasantry drifted from those failing sugar estates directly to the docks of Kingston.
Internal displacement, essentially.
Exactly. But those docks became the launching pad for the first major external wave, which were the laborers who headed to the Panamanian Isthmus.
Ah, the silvermen, as they were called.
Silvermen, yeah.
Because they were paid in silver, while the white American workers were paid in gold. They were going down there to dig the Panama Canal.
But to really understand this, you have to understand the environment they were stepping into. The records describe a truly brutal disease ecology.
Yeah, let's unpack disease ecology for a second, because that sounds very academic, right?
It does, yeah. It sanitizes it a bit.
Right. What we are actually talking about is tens of thousands of men stepping into untouched jungle, literally digging a trench between 2 oceans through thick, deep mud.
Just brutal manual labor.
And while they're doing this, they are being absolutely decimated by malaria and yellow fever. The environmental hazards were catastrophic. I mean, mudslides were burying people alive.
It was a meat grinder.
Yeah.
But again, look at the calculation there. The French had tried to build the canal, and they failed.
Right, they gave up.
The Americans took over and were just desperate for expendable labor. The Jamaicans knew the risks. The death toll was no secret at all.
No, word got back.
But the wages offered in Panama were exponentially higher than anything available in that brittle economy of Jamaica. They traded extreme physical risk for capital.
Exactly. And once that massive infrastructure project wrapped up, the global demand shifted.
Where did it go next?
It shifted from raw earth moving to agricultural and ideological expansion, which takes us to the early 20th century.
Right.
This is where we see cane cutters moving to the Spanish-speaking centrales, the massive sugar mill towns of eastern Cuba.
Okay, and this is where the story gets incredibly layered, because the American corporations had basically taken over the Cuban sugar industry, right?
Yeah, American capital was flowing in.
And they needed experienced cane cutters. So Jamaicans moved to Cuba. But they don't just assimilate into the Spanish-speaking rural landscape.
No, they don't.
The history shows us that they built Marcus Garvey-aligned enclaves right there in the middle of the plantations.
This is such an amazing detail.
I struggle to visualize this, though.
Yeah.
Like, what exactly is a Garvey-aligned enclave in the middle of 1920s Cuba?
Well, imagine this. You are in a Spanish-speaking country. You're working exhausting, back-breaking hours in the cane fields.
Right.
But instead of just blending in, these laborers built their own independent, English-speaking community halls.
Wait, really? Inside the plantation towns?
Yes. They formed chapters of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association.
That is incredible.
They were pooling their money to create mutual aid societies. They were importing and reading Garvey's Negro World newspaper.
Wow.
They were fiercely maintaining a Pan-African Jamaican identity.
That is wild. They were practically running a micro-society inside a foreign corporate plantation. And that perfectly sets up the next major shift in global demand. Because after World War II, the demand transitions again.
It does. It moves from agricultural muscle in the Americas to industrial and civic rebuilding in Europe.
The famous Windrush generation.
Yes. The British motherland had been completely bombed out during the Blitz. Their workforce was depleted.
Right.
So they called upon their colonial subjects in the Caribbean to come and rebuild the transportation networks, run the hospital wards, and man the factories.
But the welcome mat was quickly pulled away, wasn't it?
Very quickly.
They arrived as British citizens, ready to rebuild, and were met with intense racial friction. The infamous "no Irish, no blacks, no dogs" signs on housing.
Yeah, the discrimination was blatant.
The constantly shifting immigration laws designed specifically to marginalize them.
And following that era of rebuilding Europe, you see a final massive shift in our timeline. By the 1970s, the center of gravity for the diaspora permanently shifts away from the UK.
It moves across the Atlantic.
Exactly, directly over to North America, the US, and Canada. And this wasn't just manual labor anymore. This was a massive middle-class flight.
Teachers, nurses, engineers.
Right. A true brain drain driven by political instability back home.
You know, if you look at that trajectory from the mud of Panama to the corporate plantations of Cuba to the bombed-out streets of post-WWII London, and finally the professional economies of 1970s North America.
Yeah.
The Jamaican diaspora is basically a mirror reflecting modern world history.
It really is. It perfectly tracks the evolution of global industrial and economic development over the last century and a half.
But let me challenge something here.
Okay, go for it.
If these migrants are constantly dropping into these incredibly volatile, hostile environments, like fighting off yellow fever in Panama or navigating foreign languages in Cuba or facing intense, aggressive racism in Britain,
Right.
how on earth do they keep from being completely crushed? How do you drop into the middle of that volatility and not just assimilate to survive or get destroyed completely?
And that question right there marks the pivot from the vulnerability of the migrant to the profound, almost unbelievable resilience of this diaspora.
Because it is hostile out there.
Because you're right, the environments were incredibly hostile. But they were never just passive labor. They didn't just arrive, clock in, and let the host country dictate the terms of their existence.
They actively navigated the hostility.
Exactly. Let's look at how they did it. The historical data points out that from the mud of the Panama Canal to the hospital wards of London, Jamaicans did not simply export their labor.
What do?
They built what are described as cultural fortresses.
I really want to dig into that term, cultural fortresses, because when I think of a fortress, I think of thick walls, defensive positions, a place where you protect what is most valuable to you.
Right.
You don't build a fortress if your goal is to melt into the background.
No, absolutely not. You build a fortress to establish permanence on your own terms.
Okay, can you give us an example?
Let's take London in the 1950s as a concrete example of how this worked. As we mentioned, they were facing extreme housing discrimination.
The signs on the doors.
Exactly. And they were often locked out of the traditional banking system. British banks just wouldn't lend to them.
So what does the fortress look like in that scenario?
It looks like creating your own parallel infrastructure. Because they couldn't get loans, they utilized the partner system.
Unpack the partner system for us.
It's an informal, rotating savings and credit association based on deep, deep community trust.
Okay, how does it work?
A group of people all chip in a set amount of money every week into a central pot. And every week, one person gets to take the entire pot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It allowed people who were locked out of mortgages to suddenly have the capital to buy homes, start small businesses, and fund their children's education.
That is brilliant. They literally bypass the racist financial institutions by weaponizing their own community trust.
Exactly. And the fortress wasn't just economic, it was deeply cultural.
Right, because they weren't welcome in British pubs or social clubs either.
Exactly. So they created the underground blues dances in their living rooms. They imported massive custom-built sound systems.
Oh, the sound system culture.
Yes. They created distinct culinary supply chains just to get their own food.
And here's where the concept of the fortress completely blows my mind. Because they didn't just hide behind those walls, did they?
Not at all.
By protecting their culture so fiercely, they ended up fundamentally reshaping the host country.
They absolutely did.
I mean, think about it. You are brought into a country specifically as a pair of hands to sweep a floor or drive a bus. But through those sound systems and that culture, you end up completely rewiring the global music industry.
It's incredible.
You change the way London sounds, the way it eats, the way it speaks.
It is staggering power. And it's the ultimate proof that this history is not a story of an exodus.
Right.
When you build a cultural fortress in Brixton or Brooklyn or Toronto, you are ensuring your identity remains intact regardless of the geographical coordinates.
You aren't leaving Jamaica behind.
Exactly. You are planting a new piece of it in foreign soil.
Which brings us to the metaphor that I think perfectly captures everything we're talking about today.
Let's hear it.
If they never truly abandoned the island, how does the relationship between the physical island and these global fortresses actually work?
Right.
I want you, listening right now, to picture a massive ancient tree. The physical island of Jamaica is just the visible trunk.
Okay.
But beneath the surface, there is this sprawling, complex root system reaching across continents, constantly pulling nutrients back to the center to keep the tree alive.
I love that. And that root system is exactly what the research defines as circularity.
Circularity.
It's an endless loop of movement and resources. Today, the diaspora operates in a state of continuous circularity.
And how does that function day to day?
Well, there are two main arteries pumping life through those roots. The first is the macroeconomic spine of remittances.
Let's talk about remittances, because this is where the academic terms need to meet everyday reality.
Very true.
When people hear remittances, they usually just think of wire transfers. They think of, like, charity, like, oh, I'll send 20 bucks back home for a birthday.
Right, casual money.
But in the context of this 150-year-old survival strategy, it is so much more profound than that.
It is the absolute lifeblood of the nation's economy. Remittances aren't just casual gifts, they are a generational pact.
Right. So how does that actually look on the ground?
It looks like a grandmother working double shifts as a nurse in London in the 1980s, sending a portion of every single paycheck back to Kingston.
Wow.
And that money isn't just sitting in an account somewhere. It is being used to buy cinder blocks, week by week, to slowly build a family home.
That is so tangible.
It looks like an uncle in New York paying the school fees for a niece he's only met twice, ensuring she gets a degree.
It's a direct return on investment.
Exactly.
That grueling calculation that started back in 1838. The decision to invest their physical labor in foreign lands because the local market was brittle. The remittances you see today are the dividends of that exact investment paying out over generations. It is the macroeconomic spine keeping the homeland standing.
It's a perfect way to phrase it. And that economic spine is supported by the second major artery of this circularity,
Which is?
the physical return of the retirees.
Oh, this part. This part feels almost poetic to me.
It is poetic, but it's also deeply economic. Think back to the initial waves of migration we discussed.
Panama, Cuba.
Right. The global industries, whether in Panama, Cuba, or Britain, they extracted the youth, the muscle, and the physical energy of these migrants.
They took the best working years of their lives.
Exactly. But the loop doesn't end with extraction. Decades later, the physical return of the retirees completes the circle.
The tree roots pulling back.
Yes. The bodies that were utilized abroad finally return home to the island, but they do not return empty-handed.
They bring the nutrients back to the trunk of the tree.
Precisely. They bring back foreign pensions, accumulated capital, elevated global networks, and new cultural perspectives.
It all comes back.
The wealth and power that was generated inside those global cultural fortresses inevitably circles back to sustain the very island they originally had to leave.
It is an absolutely incredible system of survival in triumph. So, just to recap this journey for you before we go. We started by completely dispelling that naive myth of the spontaneous romantic exodus.
We did.
We saw how a collapsing, brittle local economy in 1838 forced a brilliant, desperate calculation.
And we tracked how the value of their labor evolved through different eras of global demand.
From the deadly raw extraction of the Panamanian disease ecology
To the ideological survival inside the Garvey-aligned enclaves of Cuban sugar plantations.
through the racial friction of rebuilding post-war Britain,
All the way to the professional shifts into North America.
we learned how they refused to just assimilate, choosing instead to build cultural fortresses like the partner banking systems and underground sound systems.
Fortresses that eventually reshaped the world.
And finally, we uncovered the root system itself. The continuous circularity of remittances and returning retirees that acts as the macroeconomic spine of Jamaica today.
It's so vital. This is the foundation you need as we prepare to dive deep into each specific era in the upcoming 6 parts of our series.
Because to truly understand the Jamaica you see today, you have to look far beyond the physical borders of the island.
You really do.
But before we officially wrap up part 1, I want to leave you with a lingering thought, a question to ponder as we move forward.
Okay.
We just talked about this massive root system, how the island is currently sustained by the remittances and the physical return of retirees who left decades ago.
Right.
But what happens to this survival strategy as time marches on?
It's the ultimate question of the transnational identity.
Exactly. What happens when the future generations of the diaspora, the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren who are born entirely inside those global fortresses in London, Toronto, or New York?
People who have never physically lived a day on the island.
Right. What happens when they inherit this network? Does that endless circle of circularity eventually break under the weight of time and distance?
The huge question.
Or does a completely new type of wealth and a totally new type of culture simply find a different way to flow back to the island?
We'll have to see.
Keep that in the back of your mind. We will see you for part 2.